Officer Jackson Richards stands frozen as the judge pronounces his sentence. Life imprisonment without parole. His crime: drawing his weapon on a black man at a veteran's funeral. The courtroom gasps when the victim's identity is revealed. 4-star. General Marcus Wilson, the nation's highest-ranking black military commander. Before we dive into this shocking story of racial injustice and its consequences, where are you watching from today? Take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to stay updated on powerful true stories that expose the reality of racism in America. The details of this case will leave you wondering, how could a routine funeral service turn into a landmark case that changed policing forever? The morning of June 12th began like any other for Officer Jackson Richards. He put on the uniform he'd worn proudly for 15 years, in the affluent suburb of Oak Ridge Heights. The mirror reflected back a man who appeared respectable on the surface. Clean-shaven, blue eyes alert, posture military straight from his time in the academy. What the mirror couldn't show was the poison that had been cultivated in his mind since childhood. Jackson grew up in a household where racism wasn't just present, it was celebrated as heritage. His father, a former beat cop himself, would come home with stories that always painted black citizens as criminals or troublemakers. His mother would nod along, adding her own commentary about those people moving into good neighborhoods. Young Jackson absorbed these lessons like scripture. "They're not like us," his father would say during dinner. "Never will be. Some things are just in the blood." By the time Jackson joined the Oak Ridge Heights Police Department, these beliefs had calcified into something unshakable. He patrolled the tree-lined streets of this predominantly white community with a particular vigilance whenever he spotted a person of color. To his colleagues, he presented himself as a professional, but his record told a different story, one that would have been clear if anyone had bothered to look closely enough. Over the past decade, Oak Ridge Heights had been changing. Black families with good incomes and impressive credentials had begun moving into the community, attracted by the excellent schools and safe neighborhoods. For many residents, this diversity was welcome. For Jackson Richards, each new black family was an intrusion, a threat to what he considered the natural order. That morning, Richards received his assignment: traffic control for the funeral of Sergeant James Taylor, a decorated black veteran who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before returning home to become a beloved high school coach. The service was expected to draw hundreds of mourners, including military personnel. "Keep it flowing smoothly," Sergeant Peterson told him during the morning briefing. "Lots of brass will be there." Taylor was well respected. Richards nodded, his face betraying nothing, but internally he seethed. Another disruption to his day, and for what? To honor someone he considered unworthy of such respect? Still, he drove to the First Baptist Church and took his position, directing traffic as the parking lot filled with somber attendees in dark suits and formal military uniforms. 3 hours into his shift, Richards noticed a black man in an expensive but civilian suit stepping out of a town car. Unlike the other military personnel who arrived in full-dress uniform, this man wore only a small pin on his lapel. Richards watched with narrowed eyes as the man nodded respectfully to the uniformed soldiers who immediately straightened their posture in his presence. Something about this man's confident walk, the way others deferred to him, triggered Richards' deepest prejudices. In his mind, a black man commanding such respect without a uniform had to be an imposter or troublemaker, perhaps even a security threat. Richards abandoned his traffic post without radioing in and approached with his hand already resting on his holster. "Excuse me," Richards called out, his voice deliberately authoritative. "This is a restricted service. I need to see some identification." The man turned calmly, his expression measured. He was in his early 60s, with closely cropped gray hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. "Of course, officer," he replied, reaching slowly for his wallet. "I'm General Marcus Wilson. Sergeant Taylor served under my command during his first tour. I'm here to pay my respects." Richard's prejudice blinded him to everything: the man's dignified manner, the quality of his clothes, even the deferential reactions of the military personnel nearby. All he saw was a black man he believed didn't belong. "Right, General," Richard said, the quotation marks audible in his tone. "I'm going to need more than just your word on that." General Wilson produced his military ID with the 4 stars of his rank clearly visible. Richards barely glanced at it before saying, "This could be fake. There's no way you're a 4-star general." By now, a small crowd had gathered. A young soldier stepped forward. "Officer, that's General Wilson. He's the deputy chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff." Richards ignored him. His hand moved from his holster to grip his weapon. "Step back from the church entrance now," he ordered. General Wilson remained perfectly composed. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job, but there seems to be a misunderstanding. Perhaps we could speak with the funeral director or another officer to clear this up." The reasonableness of this response only infuriated Richards more. In one fluid motion, he drew his weapon and pointed it directly at General Wilson's chest. "On the ground now!" he shouted. The crowd gasped. Several people already had their phones out, recording the entire incident. General Wilson did not move, his hands visible but his dignity intact. "Officer," Wilson said quietly, "you are pointing a loaded weapon at a senior military officer at a funeral for one of our fallen brothers. I strongly suggest you reconsider your actions." For 10 excruciating seconds, Richards kept his weapon aimed at the general. Only when another police officer raced over, shouting his name, did Richards finally lower his gun. But the damage was already done. Within 30 minutes, the video was online. Within an hour, it had been viewed 50,000 times. By evening, millions had watched Officer Jackson Richards threaten the life of one of the nation's highest-ranking military officers simply because he couldn't believe a black man could hold such a position. The first statement from the Oak Ridge Heights Police Department came exactly 2 hours after the incident. "We are aware of an interaction between one of our officers and a funeral attendee. The matter is under investigation." The inadequacy of these words would soon become apparent as the nation's outrage grew to a deafening roar. General Marcus Wilson had dedicated 35 years of his life to military service. Starting as a second lieutenant fresh out of West Point, he had distinguished himself in Desert Storm, peacekeeping missions in the Balkans, and 2 tours in Iraq. His strategic brilliance and leadership qualities earned him promotion after promotion, breaking racial barriers at each new rank. When he achieved his 4th star, becoming one of only a handful of black 4-star generals in American history, the Washington Post had published a profile titled, "America's Quiet Warrior." What many people didn't know until the incident went viral was that Wilson had a personal connection to Sergeant James Taylor beyond their military service. Taylor's mother had worked as a housekeeper for Wilson's parents when they were both children. They had grown up playing together during summers before life took them on different paths. When they reconnected in Afghanistan, it seemed like destiny. Wilson had personally recommended Taylor for officer candidate school, though Taylor ultimately decided to remain a non-commissioned officer. As videos of the incident exploded across social media, these personal details emerged, making Richards' actions seem even more egregious. Here was a man attending the funeral of a lifelong friend, being treated like a criminal at the service, meant to honor that friendship. Throughout the confrontation, General Wilson had maintained the composure that had served him through battlefield decisions and tense Pentagon negotiations. Even with a gun pointed at his chest, he hadn't raised his voice or made any sudden movements that could escalate the situation. This restraint, captured clearly on multiple videos, made Richards appear all the more irrational and dangerous. Inside the church, the Taylor family had been informed of the disturbance outside. The funeral, which should have been solely focused on celebrating James Taylor's life and service, was now tinged with the very racism he had fought against throughout his career. His widow, Elaine Taylor, later described feeling as though her husband was being disrespected even in death. "James spent his life standing up against prejudice," she told reporters the next day, her voice steady despite her grief. "That an officer sworn to protect and serve would display such bigotry at his funeral is beyond painful. It's a reminder of why my husband's work isn't done." The initial statement from the Oak Ridge Heights Police Department had attempted to minimize the incident, but as the general's identity became public knowledge, that approach became untenable. By nightfall, the department's switchboard was jammed with calls demanding Richards' badge. The mayor's office reported similar call volumes. National news organizations dispatched reporters to the previously unremarkable suburb. Mayor Amanda Calloway, the first woman to hold the position in Oak Ridge Heights, called an emergency meeting with Police Chief Robert Morrison. Unlike her predecessor, who might have tried to weather the storm, Calloway understood immediately that decisive action was required. "Suspend him. Today. Without pay," she directed Morrison. "And I want a full investigation, not just the usual internal affairs whitewash. This happened on our watch and we need to own it." Chief Morrison, only 18 months into the job after replacing the retired Thomas Wilkins, nodded in agreement. He had been working to reform department culture since taking over, facing resistance from old guard officers like Richards. "I've already called Captain Rodriguez in internal affairs," Morrison said. "She's our best investigator and she won't pull punches even for a fellow officer." Captain Elena Rodriguez was a 20-year veteran who had worked her way up from patrol, despite facing both gender and racial discrimination. Known for her methodical thoroughness, she began her investigation by securing Richard's body cam footage, only to discover it had been disabled during the incident. The camera shows footage of him directing traffic, then goes dark approximately 3 minutes before the confrontation with General Wilson, she reported to Chief Morrison. "The department policy is absolutely clear. Body cams remain on throughout an entire shift unless there's a bathroom break or legitimate privacy concern." This discovery immediately elevated the seriousness of the investigation. Had Richards deliberately disabled his camera before approaching Wilson? The timing suggested premeditation rather than an impulsive mistake. Rodriguez interviewed 28 witnesses over the next 3 days. Their accounts aligned remarkably consistently. Richards had approached Wilson aggressively, dismissed his identification, ignored the confirmations of his identity from military personnel, and escalated to deadly force without provocation. Not a single witness described behavior from General Wilson that could justify Richards' response. As Rodriguez dug deeper, she uncovered disturbing patterns in Richards' 15-year career. Black drivers were 4 times more likely to be pulled over by Richards than by other officers patrolling the same areas. Once stopped, they were 7 times more likely to be searched. The statistical anomalies were so stark that Rodriguez wondered how they had gone unaddressed for so long. The answer came when she accessed complaint records from Richards' personnel file. Over his career, 11 formal complaints had been filed against him by black citizens alleging harassment, excessive force, or disrespect. All 11 had been dismissed during Chief Wilkins' tenure with minimal investigation. Wilkins' notes on one complaint read simply, "Officer's word against civilian. Case closed." While Rodriguez built her case, General Wilson held a press conference. Standing ramrod straight in his full dress uniform, ribbons and medals attesting to his service, he spoke with the measured tone of a man accustomed to choosing his words carefully. "This incident is not about me," he began, silencing the shouted questions from reporters. "I have the privilege of rank and recognition that protected me, even with a gun pointed at my chest. Many of our citizens do not have those protections. This is about a systemic problem that allows some officers to see the color of a person's skin as a threat. Sergeant James Taylor deserved better. All Americans deserve better." Wilson refused to make personal attacks against Richards or call for specific punishments. Instead, he focused on the need for accountability and reform. His dignity in the face of such treatment only elevated public support for him and intensified scrutiny on the Oak Ridge Heights Police Department. By the end of the week, Captain Rodriguez had compiled enough evidence to recommend criminal charges against Officer Richards. The body cam deactivation, the pattern of racial bias in his enforcement actions, the excessive force in a situation that presented no threat, all pointed to serious misconduct. She placed her comprehensive report on Chief Morrison's desk, knowing the political firestorm it would ignite. The evidence supports charges of aggravated assault, official misconduct, civil rights violations, and potentially hate crime enhancements, Rodriguez concluded in her executive summary. Officer Richards represented the worst of policing on that day, and the evidence suggests it wasn't an isolated incident, but a pattern throughout his career. Chief Morrison read the report twice, each page confirming his worst fears. The department he had inherited from Wilkins was more deeply flawed than he had realized. Richards wasn't just one bad apple. He was a symptom of a culture that had been allowed to fester. Morrison picked up his phone to call the mayor. The time for half measures had passed. The morning after Captain Rodriguez submitted her report, Chief Robert Morrison called an all-hands meeting of the Oak Ridge Heights Police Department. The tension in the briefing room was palpable as officers filed in, many already aware of the bombshell conclusions in Rodriguez's investigation. Morrison stood at the podium, his normally affable face grave as he surveyed the men and women under his command. "I won't sugarcoat this," Morrison began. "Officer Richards's actions have brought shame on this department and violated everything the badge stands for. The investigation has uncovered evidence of persistent racial bias in his policing, deliberate deactivation of his body cam, and excessive force against a distinguished military officer who posed zero threat." Morrison paused, noting the diverse reactions across the room. Some officers nodded in agreement while others crossed their arms defensively. The division was visible and immediate. "Effective immediately. I am forwarding Captain Rodriguez's findings to the district attorney with a recommendation for criminal charges. The evidence is overwhelming and disturbing." A murmur rolled through the room. Senior Officer Patrick Donahue, a 20-year veteran and close friend of Richards, stood up without being recognized. "Chief, with all due respect, Richards was doing his job. We're trained to maintain security and question people who don't seem to belong. Are we supposed to just take everyone at their word now?" Before Morrison could respond, Officer Darnell Washington, Richards' black partner for the past 3 years, rose from his seat. "That's bull and you know it, Donahue," Washington said, his voice controlled but intense. "I've ridden with Richards for 3 years. I've heard his comments when it's just us in the car. I've seen how differently he treats black citizens versus white ones. This wasn't about security. It was about Richards not believing a black man could be a 4-star general." The room erupted with officers taking sides and talking over one another. Morrison slammed his hand on the podium repeatedly until order was restored. "This is exactly the problem," Morrison shouted, rare anger coloring his face. "Some of you are more concerned about protecting a colleague who disgraced his uniform than addressing the harm done to our community. That ends today." Think about this for a moment. If you were in Chief Morrison's position, caught between loyalty to your officers and the clear evidence of wrongdoing, what would you do? Comment number 1 if you believe Morrison is right to fully support charges against Richards, or number 2 if you think police departments should handle these matters internally. This decision will change lives forever. But whose side of justice are you on? Hit like and subscribe as we continue this true story of a police department torn apart by racism and accountability. As the meeting continued, the battle lines within the department became increasingly clear. Roughly 60% of the officers supported the chief's position, while a vocal minority rallied around Richards, claiming he was being sacrificed to political correctness. The police union representative announced they would provide Richards with legal counsel, regardless of the department's position. In the days that followed, Officer Washington faced increasing hostility from Richards' supporters. His locker was vandalized with racial slurs. Anonymous threats were left on his desk. Fellow officers who had previously been friendly suddenly had no time to talk. Washington reported each incident to Captain Rodriguez, who documented them meticulously, but could rarely prove who was responsible. "They're trying to make an example of me," Washington told Rodriguez during one interview, "to show what happens when you don't back the blue no matter what." But Richards crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. "I became a cop to protect people, not to terrorize them because of their skin color." While the department fractured along these lines, Detective Sarah Chen from the Computer Crimes Unit made a disturbing discovery. Assigned to examine Richards's department-issued phone and personal devices, she uncovered his membership in a private online forum called True Blue, where officers from across the country shared racist memes, coordinated harassment of civil rights activists, and boasted about racially motivated enforcement actions. His username was Blue Knight 88, Chen reported to Chief Morrison, noting that 88 was a common white supremacist code for Heil Hitler. He was an active participant for at least 7 years, posting regularly about cleaning up Oak Ridge Heights and keeping it the way it should be. Armed with a search warrant for Richard's home, detectives discovered a hidden room in his basement containing white supremacist literature, a collection of racist memorabilia, and disturbing manifestos about racial purity. The evidence painted a picture not of an officer who had a momentary lapse in judgment, but of a man who had carried hatred in his heart throughout his career while wearing a badge. District Attorney Vanessa Jeffries, a respected prosecutor known for her fairness, reviewed the mounting evidence and announced her decision to pursue maximum charges, including a hate crime enhancement that could significantly increase Richard's sentence if convicted. The evidence shows clear racial animus motivating this assault, she stated at a press conference. Officer Richard's actions were not just a violation of his oath and General Wilson's civil rights, but a hate crime directed at a black man for having the audacity to hold a position of respect. As these developments unfolded, Chief Morrison faced his own internal struggle. He had inherited a department from his predecessor, Thomas Wilkins, but hadn't fully understood the extent of the rot within. New evidence suggested Wilkins had systematically buried complaints against officers, like Richards, who shared his worldview while driving out officers who reported misconduct. Morrison's office had become command central for a department in crisis. On his desk sat resignation letters from 3 officers who couldn't stomach the direction of the investigation, alongside requests for transfers from officers who had faced harassment for supporting accountability. The community that had once seen the department as protectors now held daily protests outside the station, demanding justice and reform. Late one evening, as Morrison reviewed personnel files looking for other potential problem officers, he discovered a memo written by Wilkins just before retirement. In it, Wilkins had identified Morrison as a problem for his excessive concern with community relations and had specifically recommended promoting Richards to sergeant after Morrison had been in place for 2 years to maintain departmental tradition and values. The document confirmed Morrison's worst suspicions. His predecessor had deliberately left landmines throughout the department designed to undermine reform efforts. Richards wasn't just one bad officer, he was intended to be the standard bearer for a vision of policing that Morrison had been fighting against. With this revelation, Morrison made his decision. He would not only fully cooperate with prosecutors, but would use the Richards case as a catalyst for complete departmental transformation. The old guard might resist, the union might fight him, but the badge had been tarnished for too long by those who saw some citizens as less deserving of protection and respect. "We're going to rebuild this department from the ground up," Morrison told Captain Rodriguez after sharing the Wilkins memo. "Every policy, every training protocol, every promotion metric. If I have to lose half the force to gain back the communities I trust, so be it." Rodriguez, who had faced her own battles against department prejudice throughout her career, nodded her agreement. "It's long overdue, Chief, but it won't be easy. The old guard has deep roots. So do oak trees," Morrison replied, referencing the city's name. "But when they're diseased, sometimes you have to cut them down to save the forest." Outside the station, the protesters continued their vigil, their signs illuminated by streetlights. "Justice for all, not just some. Reform OHPD now. Badges don't grant immunity." The chants would continue through the night, a constant reminder of the community's demands for accountability. Inside, a police department teetered on the edge of transformation, with the outcome far from certain. Victor Sloan's corner office on the 15th floor of Oak Ridge Heights' only skyscraper offered a panoramic view of the city he had called home for 30 years. At 62, with silver hair and custom suits, Sloan had built a reputation as the go-to attorney for police officers facing misconduct allegations. His record was impressive. Of 38 officers he had represented, 34 had returned to duty with minimal consequences. The police union had him on permanent retainer. When the call came about Officer Jackson Richards, Sloan initially saw it as just another case. By the time he finished reviewing the evidence, he recognized it might be the most challenging defense of his career, but challenging cases commanded higher fees, and Sloan had put 2 children through Ivy League schools by taking on the impossible. "The optics are problematic," Sloan told Richards during their first meeting in the county jail's attorney room. Richards had been denied bail, unusual for a police officer but reflective of the case's high profile. Pointing your weapon at a four-star general, especially one as respected as Wilson, gives us an uphill battle. Richard sat across from Sloan in an orange jumpsuit, his former confidence diminished by a week in custody. I was doing my job. He didn't identify himself properly. I had no way of knowing he was really a general. Sloan suppressed a sigh. The body cam footage from before Richards disabled his camera, witness statements, and Wilson's military ID all contradicted this version of events. Still, Sloan began outlining his strategy. We'll focus on proper police procedure. You were securing a high-profile event. Wilson was in civilian clothes when other military personnel were in uniform. You had reasonable suspicion to question his presence. Richards nodded eagerly. Exactly, and he was argumentative. No, Sloan corrected sharply. The videos show he was calm and cooperative. We can't claim otherwise when dozens of witnesses and multiple recordings contradict it. We'll argue that from your perspective, his calmness could have seemed suspicious given the circumstances. Over the next few weeks, Sloan's strategy evolved along several tracks. First, he filed motions to suppress evidence from Richards' personal devices and home, claiming Fourth Amendment violations in the search warrants. Next, he began a subtle media campaign questioning General Wilson's reaction to the incident, suggesting the general was leveraging it for political gain. General Wilson has become quite the celebrity since this unfortunate misunderstanding, Sloan told a sympathetic radio host. One has to wonder if his immediate press conferences and media appearances serve justice or his own profile. The smear attempt backfired spectacularly. Wilson's decades of quiet, distinguished service stood in stark contrast to Richards's troubling history. Furthermore, Wilson had explicitly refused to make the case about himself, consistently redirecting attention to broader issues of police reform and racial justice. As the discovery phase progressed, more damaging evidence emerged against Richards. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court described him as having deeply ingrained racial biases and an authoritarian personality with minimal capacity for self-reflection or admission of error. The evaluator noted Richards showed more distress over the damage to his career than any concern for how his actions had affected others. Sloan's attempts to suppress evidence from Richards' electronic devices failed when the judge ruled the search warrants had been properly obtained based on probable cause. This opened the door for prosecutors to introduce Richards' participation in racist online forums, his disturbing private messages about black citizens, and his collection of white supremacist materials. Perhaps most damaging to Richards' defense was the unexpected position taken by his wife, Melissa. Initially supporting her husband publicly, Melissa's perspective shifted dramatically as evidence of his true beliefs came to light. The True Blue Forum posts included comments about keeping their neighborhood pure that shocked her, revealing a side of her husband she claimed not to have known. I married a police officer, not a Klansman without a hood, she reportedly told friends. When Sloan arranged a meeting to prepare her for potential testimony, Melissa arrived with her own attorney and announced she would not be a character witness for the defense. Instead, she was filing for divorce and would testify truthfully, if called by either side. This personal betrayal seemed to affect Richards more than the criminal charges. During a pre-trial hearing, he shouted at Melissa as she entered the courtroom, calling her a traitor and making threats that resulted in additional charges for witness intimidation. The outburst undermined Sloan's efforts to present Richards as a professional who had made an error in judgment rather than a rage-filled bigot. With his client increasingly uncooperative and the evidence mounting, Sloan made a desperate attempt to arrange a plea deal. He approached District Attorney Jeffries with an offer. Richards would plead guilty to misconduct and excessive force in exchange for dropping the hate crime charges and recommending a 5-year sentence with possibility of parole after 2 years. Jeffries didn't even consider the offer. Your client held a gun on an unarmed black man attending a friend's funeral, simply because he couldn't believe a black man could be a general, she responded. The evidence shows this wasn't an isolated incident, but the culmination of a career built on racism. The people of Oak Ridge Heights deserve to see this case tried on its full merits. Sloan returned to his office to recalibrate. The case had become a referendum not just on Richards, but on policing in America. The national media covered every development. Civil rights organizations filed amicus briefs. Police unions across the country watched nervously, aware of the precedent that could be set. In a last-ditch effort to salvage some advantage, Sloan filed a motion to change the venue, arguing Richards couldn't receive a fair trial in Oak Ridge Heights due to media coverage and community protests. The judge denied the motion, noting that the case had received nationwide attention and no venue would be free from awareness of it. As the trial date approached, Richards's initial confidence crumbled completely. The man who had swaggered through the police station for 15 years now shuffled into court meetings, pale and disheveled. During one session, he broke down entirely. "They're going to bury me," he sobbed to Sloan. "The department, the chief, even Melissa, they've all abandoned me for doing what I was trained to do." Sloan placed a hand on his client's shoulder, not unkindly. "Jackson, I need you to understand something. I'll defend you vigorously because that's my job, but the evidence doesn't support your version of events. You weren't abandoned for doing your job. The videos, your online posts, your history of complaints, they tell a different story. If you want any chance at all, you need to start being honest, at least with yourself." Richard stared at him blankly, then straightened his posture, the vulnerability vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. "Just do your job, counselor. I'm innocent until proven guilty, right? That still applies to cops in this country, doesn't it?" Sloan gathered his papers without answering. The trial would begin in 3 days, and he knew better than most what the evidence would reveal to the jury. As he left the detention center, reporters shouted questions about Richard's state of mind and defense strategy. Sloan offered only his standard response. "My client maintains his innocence and looks forward to his day in court where all the facts will be presented." The facts, Sloan knew, would likely send Richards to prison for decades. Some cases were simply unwinnable. The best he could hope for now was to mitigate the damage, not just to Richards, but to a legal system that had allowed him to carry a badge and gun while harboring such hatred for those he had sworn to protect. Transform tragedy into lasting positive change. The Oak Ridge Heights County Courthouse, a stately building of granite and marble constructed in 1923, had witnessed nearly a century of justice being served, or sometimes denied. On the morning of October 3rd, it became the epicenter of national attention as the trial of Officer Jackson Richards began. News vans lined the streets. Demonstrators on both sides held signs and chanted slogans. Extra security personnel monitored metal detectors and conducted bag searches. Inside courtroom 3. Jury selection had been a painstaking 2-week process. Defense attorney Victor Sloan and district attorney Vanessa Jeffries had questioned over 200 potential jurors, probing their views on law enforcement, racial bias, and their ability to remain impartial despite the case's notoriety. The resulting jury of 12 included 4 black members, 6 white, 1 Asian American, and 1 Hispanic American, roughly reflecting the changing demographics of Oak Ridge Heights itself. Judge Eleanor Winters, a 25-year veteran of the bench known for her no-nonsense approach, called the court to order precisely at 9 a.m. At 72, with steel gray hair and piercing blue eyes, Judge Winters had a reputation for running an efficient courtroom and showing little patience for grandstanding from either side. "The court will come to order in the case of the people versus Jackson Richards," she announced, her voice carrying to the back of the packed gallery. "I'll remind everyone that outbursts or demonstrations of any kind will result in immediate removal from this courtroom." Richard sat at the defense table in a navy blue suit that hung loosely on his frame, having lost weight during his pre-trial detention. Beside him, Sloan projected confidence despite the challenges he knew lay ahead. At the prosecution table, District Attorney Jeffries reviewed her notes alongside her second chair, Assistant DA Marcus Coleman. After the formalities of reading, the charges, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, official misconduct, civil rights violations, and hate crime enhancements, Judge Winters invited the opening statements. Jeffries approached the jury box first, her burgundy suit and measured steps projecting authority. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "this case is about abuse of power in its most fundamental form. The evidence will show that on June 12th, Officer Jackson Richards approached General Marcus Wilson with prejudice in his heart and hatred in his mind. When faced with irrefutable evidence that he was confronting a four-star general, one of the highest-ranking military officers in our nation, Richards chose to escalate to deadly force rather than acknowledge his mistake. Jeffries walked the jury through what they would see and hear: multiple video recordings of the incident, testimony from witnesses who saw Richards' aggression and Wilson's calm response, evidence of Richards' body cam being deliberately disabled, and a pattern of racial bias throughout his career. Most disturbing, Jeffries continued, the evidence will show this was not an isolated incident or momentary lapse in judgment. Officer Richards' 15-year career reveals a consistent pattern of targeting black citizens, using excessive force against them and dehumanizing them in his private communications. The incident with General Wilson didn't create a racist officer. It simply exposed one who had been hiding behind a badge for years. Sloan's opening statement offered the counter-narrative he had carefully constructed despite the evidence stacked against his client. Police officers make split-second decisions to protect public safety, he told the jury. Officer Richards was assigned to secure a high-profile funeral attended by military and political figures. When he observed an individual in civilian clothes at an event where military personnel were in uniform, he had legitimate reason for concern. Did he handle the situation perfectly? No. But was his action motivated by racial hatred rather than a good faith effort to maintain security? Absolutely not. Sloan emphasized Richards' years of service, the stresses police officers face daily, and the dangers of second-guessing their judgment from the comfort of hindsight. It was a practiced performance from an attorney who had made similar arguments dozens of times before. This time, however, the jury's expression suggested skepticism. The prosecution's case began with testimony from funeral attendees who had witnessed the confrontation. First was Reverend Calvin Thompson, who had been greeting mourners outside the church when the incident occurred. Officer Richards approached General Wilson with his hand already on his weapon, Reverend Thompson testified. The general presented his ID calmly, but the officer barely looked at it. When other military personnel confirmed the general's identity, the officer ignored them completely. During cross-examination, Sloan attempted to suggest Reverend Thompson's view had been obstructed, or his recollection influenced by media coverage. Thompson's responses remained consistent, and his certainty unshaken. The emotional center of the day came when Elaine Taylor, widow of Sergeant James Taylor, took the stand. Still wearing the black of mourning, she described how the confrontation had affected the funeral service meant to honor her husband. James served this country for 22 years, she said, her voice steady despite her evident grief. He believed in America's promise even when America didn't always deliver on that promise for people who looked like him. To have an officer disrupt his funeral by drawing a weapon on General Wilson, a man James respected more than almost anyone, felt like a desecration of everything he stood for. Sloan's cross-examination was gentle, acknowledging Mrs. Taylor's loss while trying to establish that from inside the church, she hadn't witnessed the incident directly. Her response silenced the courtroom. "I didn't need to see it happen to know what it meant," she said. "My husband came home with stories like this his entire life, being pulled over for no reason, being followed in stores, being asked if he belonged in our own neighborhood." Officer Richards brought that same bigotry to the one day that should have been solely about honoring James's service and life. The prosecution then presented technical analysis of the viral videos, enhanced and synchronized by FBI forensic experts, to provide a comprehensive view of the encounter from multiple angles. The silent footage spoke volumes. Richards' aggressive approach, his dismissive examination of Wilson's identification, the unnecessary escalation to drawing his weapon, and the visible shock of bystanders. When General Marcus Wilson finally took the stand on the third day, the courtroom was so quiet that the air conditioning system seemed thunderous by comparison. In his full dress uniform with 4 stars gleaming on each shoulder, Wilson cut an imposing figure, yet his testimony was delivered with the same calm dignity he had shown during the confrontation. "I arrived approximately 20 minutes before the service was scheduled to begin," Wilson testified, his deep voice steady and measured. Sergeant Taylor and I had a long history together. I wanted to pay my respects to his family privately before the formal proceedings." Wilson recounted the confrontation in precise detail, neither embellishing nor downplaying what had occurred. He described Richards's approach, the presentation of his identification, the attempts by others to confirm his identity, and Richards's escalation to deadly force. "At no point did I feel the officer was following proper procedure," Wilson stated. "In my 35 years of military service, I've trained thousands of personnel in security protocols. Officer Richards' actions violated basic principles of threat assessment and proportional response." During cross-examination, Sloan attempted what many considered a risky strategy, trying to provoke Wilson into showing anger or resentment that might undermine his credibility with the jury. "General Wilson, isn't it true that you've spoken at several events focused on police reform since this incident? That you've leveraged this unfortunate misunderstanding to advance a political agenda?" Wilson's response was measured but firm. "Counselor, I've dedicated my life to protecting this nation and upholding its highest ideals. When I saw those ideals violated by someone sworn to uphold the law, I considered it my duty as a citizen and a soldier to speak about the experience. This isn't political, it's patriotic." Sloan pressed harder. "You must have felt angry having a weapon pointed at you. Isn't it possible your recollection is colored by that emotional response?" "I've had weapons pointed at me in combat situations, Counselor," Wilson replied evenly. "My training is to remain calm and assess the situation, objectively. That's precisely what I did that day, and what I'm doing now in this courtroom." Every attempt to rattle Wilson failed, leaving his testimony unimpeached. As he stepped down from the witness stand, several jurors nodded respectfully in his direction. The prosecution continued building its case with testimony from Officer Darnell Washington, Richards's former partner. Washington described numerous instances of Richards treating black citizens differently than white ones during their 3 years patrolling together. He'd run license plates of black drivers for no reason, looking for any excuse to pull them over, Washington testified. "Once, after searching a black teenager's car and finding nothing, he told me, 'They're all hiding something. You just have to look harder.'" Washington faced intense questioning from Sloan about why he hadn't reported these incidents earlier. His answer resonated with many officers watching the proceedings. "The culture doesn't reward speaking up," Washington explained. "Officers who report misconduct get labeled as snitches or troublemakers. Their backup arrives slower on dangerous calls. Their promotion opportunities disappear. I'm not proud of my silence, but I understood the consequences of breaking that code." Detective Sarah Chen provided technical testimony about Richards' online activities, walking the jury through his participation in racist forums and the disturbing content found on his devices. Using screen captures and forensic data, she demonstrated that Richards's racism wasn't casual or occasional, but a defining aspect of his worldview that he nurtured regularly through these online communities. The username BlueKnight88 posted over 3,000 comments in the True Blue forum over 7 years, Chen testified. Approximately 62% contained explicit racial slurs or derogatory language about black citizens, particularly those moving into what he called traditionally white neighborhoods. As the prosecution's case neared conclusion, Richards appeared increasingly agitated, frequently whispering urgently to Sloan or writing furious notes. The evidence against him had been presented methodically, building a comprehensive picture of an officer whose racism had finally led to an action too public and egregious to ignore or excuse. On the final day of the prosecution's case, District Attorney Jeffries called a surprise witness, former Police Chief Thomas Wilkins. Initially reluctant to testify, Wilkins had been compelled by subpoena. His testimony would prove crucial in establishing the departmental culture that had enabled Richards for years. Wilkins, a heavyset man with a perpetual scowl, took the stand with obvious reluctance. Under Jeffries' questioning, he admitted to dismissing multiple complaints against Richards without thorough investigation. "We received a high volume of civilian complaints," Wilkins explained defensively. "It wasn't possible to investigate every single one with limited resources. Yet Officer Richards had 11 complaints specifically alleging racial bias, Jeffries countered. That was significantly higher than any other officer in the department. Did that pattern not concern you? Wilkins shifted uncomfortably. Some officers work in higher crime areas. That naturally leads to more complaints. Jeffries displayed a map of Oak Ridge Heights with patrol zones clearly marked. Officer Richards patrolled Sector 7, one of the lowest crime areas in the city, yet had the highest complaint rate in the department. How do you explain that disparity? Unable to provide a reasonable explanation, Wilkins eventually conceded that he had considered Richards a good officer who maintained order in a changing community, revealing dog whistle language that further damaged Richards's defense. As the prosecution rested its case, media analysts and legal experts agreed. Jeffries and her team had presented overwhelming evidence of Richards's racial animus and its direct connection to his actions toward Ace. General Wilson. The question was no longer whether Richards would be convicted, but how severe his sentence would be. Victor Sloan had built his reputation on defending difficult cases, but even he recognized the mountain of evidence his client faced. Nevertheless, he launched the defense case with the confidence of a man holding 4 aces, calling expert witnesses to testify about police procedures and the split-second decisions officers must make in potential security situations. Dr. Lawrence Miller, a former police officer turned psychologist specializing in law enforcement training, took the stand as the defense's first expert witness. With silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, he projected academic authority as he discussed threat assessment protocols. Officers are trained to establish control of uncertain situations, Miller testified. When someone doesn't immediately comply, or when their presence seems inconsistent with the environment, officers are taught to escalate their response until compliance is achieved. During cross-examination, District Attorney Jeffries methodically dismantled this explanation. Dr. Miller, in the video we've all seen, General Wilson presented his identification immediately when requested, correct? Yes, that appears to be the case. And multiple uniformed military personnel confirmed his identity to Officer Richards? Yes, but in a security situation, officers are taught to rely on their own assessment rather than bystander input. So even when that input comes from other uniformed authorities, is that standard procedure in any police department you're familiar with? Miller's hesitation spoke volumes. It would be unusual to dismiss such corroboration completely. Jeffries continued, in your expert opinion, Dr. Miller, does proper police procedure include pointing a weapon at an unarmed individual who has presented identification and posed no physical threat? There are circumstances where, in this specific circumstance, Dr. Miller, based on the video evidence and testimony, after a long pause, Miller conceded, no, that would not align with standard procedure. The defense attempted to recover with character witnesses, including Richards's childhood friend Thomas Brennan, who insisted Richards had grown up in a colorblind household where race was never discussed. This testimony backfired when Jeffries introduced Richards' father's social media posts containing explicitly racist content, suggesting the household was far from colorblind. Have you ever witnessed someone's carefully constructed facade crumble under the weight of evidence? Comment number 1 if you believe Richards genuinely thought he was just doing his job, or number 2 if you think his actions were clearly motivated by racism. While the defense struggles to make their case, don't forget to like and subscribe for more true stories that expose injustice in America. Would Richards take the stand himself? The answer might surprise you as much as it did his own attorney. As the defense case faltered, Sloan faced a critical decision, whether to put Richards on the stand. Defendants in criminal trials aren't required to testify, and many attorneys advise against it, particularly when cross-examination could expose damaging inconsistencies. But Richards insisted on telling his side of the story, overriding Sloan's concerns. The jury needs to hear from me, Richards argued during a conference in the holding cell. Everyone's painting me as some kind of monster. I need to show them I'm a real person who was just doing my job. Sloan's warnings about the risks fell on deaf ears. Richards took the stand on the 9th day of trial, taking the oath with a steady voice that belied his inner turmoil. Under Sloan's careful direct examination, Richards presented himself as a dedicated officer concerned only with public safety. He described the funeral as a high-risk environment due to the presence of military and political figures. He claimed he approached Wilson because he wasn't in uniform like other military personnel and seemed to be moving purposefully toward the church entrance. "I asked for identification, which is standard procedure," Richards testified. "When he produced what appeared to be military ID, I had concerns about its authenticity given that he was in civilian clothes. My training taught me to maintain control of the situation until all security concerns were resolved." Asked about the racist online posts and materials found in his home, Richards claimed the online forum was just officers blowing off steam and that the materials in his home belonged to a friend who was staying with me temporarily. These explanations sounded hollow, even to sympathetic observers. Richards's demeanor changed dramatically when District Attorney Jeffries began her cross-examination. Her first questions focused not on the incident itself, but on Richards' history in the department. "Officer Richards, during your 15 years with Oak Ridge Heights Police, you conducted approximately 8,000 traffic stops. Is that correct according to department records?" "That sounds about right. And of those stops, 63% involved black drivers, despite black residents making up only 17% of the population in your patrol sector. How do you explain that disparity?" Richards shifted uncomfortably. "I don't target based on race. I stop vehicles for legitimate violations." Jeffries displayed a chart showing stop rates by race for all officers patrolling the same sector. "Your colleagues averaged 22% black drivers stopped in identical patrol areas. Were they missing violations, or were you seeing something they weren't?" As Jeffries methodically walked through the statistical evidence of Richards' biased policing, his composure began to crack. His answers grew shorter, his tone defensive. When she turned to the incident with General Wilson, the facade crumbled entirely. "Officer Richards, the video clearly shows General Wilson presented his military ID with 4 stars clearly visible. Multiple officers have testified that a 4-star general's identification is distinctive and unmistakable. Do you maintain you couldn't identify his rank?" "It happened quickly. I wasn't sure. The video shows you held his ID for 12 seconds. Is that a quick glance in your estimation?" Richards' face flushed. "Look, I've seen fake IDs before. Have you ever seen a fake 4-star general's ID in your 15 years of service?" "No, but in fact, no such counterfeit has ever been documented by any law enforcement agency in the United States, has it?" Richards's frustration boiled over. How was I supposed to know some black guy in a suit was really a general? It didn't make sense. The courtroom fell silent at this outburst. Sloan closed his eyes briefly, knowing the damage was irreparable. Jeffries let the statement hang in the air for a long moment before asking quietly, "So it didn't make sense to you that a black man could be a 4-star general? Is that your testimony to this jury?" Richards seemed to realize his error too late. "That's not what I meant. I just meant it was unusual. Unusual for a black man to hold high rank, despite General Wilson's 35 years of distinguished service?" As Jeffries continued her methodical dismantling of Richards's testimony, his earlier confidence gave way to visible anger. His responses became increasingly combative and contradictory. When Jeffries presented screenshots of his racist forum posts that directly contradicted his testimony, Richards finally snapped. "You don't understand what it's like," he shouted, his face contorted with rage. "These people move into our neighborhoods, take over everything. Someone has to maintain order, keep things the way they should be." Judge Winters banged her gavel. "Control yourself, Mr. Richards, or you'll be removed from the courtroom." Richards subsided, but the damage was done. His outburst had revealed precisely the racist motivations the prosecution had been establishing throughout the trial. Sloan attempted damage control with redirect examination, but Richards' credibility was shattered beyond repair. The defense's final strategy involved calling former Police Chief Wilkins back to the stand, hoping he would provide context about department policies that might mitigate Richards' actions. This backfired spectacularly when Wilkins, seemingly resigned to the inevitable outcome, admitted under questioning that he had deliberately turned a blind eye to complaints against officers who maintained traditional standards in the community. a thinly veiled endorsement of racially biased policing. Did you ever formally discipline Officer Richards for any of the 11 complaints filed against him? Sloan asked, expecting a defense of his client. No, Wilkins replied. I considered Richards one of my best officers. He understood what we were really there to do. And what was that, Chief Wilkins? Sloan asked, already regretting the question. Wilkins looked directly at Richards before answering. Keep Oak Ridge Heights the kind of community people move there for. The right kind of community, if you understand me. Sloan had no further questions. The defense had effectively collapsed with its own witness implicitly confirming the culture of racism that had enabled Richards. In a last desperate attempt to salvage something from the case, Sloan called Dr. Helen Bradford, a medical examiner, to testify about the psychological impact of stress on police officers. Her testimony about how stress can affect perception and decision-making offered little help, given the overwhelming evidence of Richards' long-standing racial animus. As the defense rested its case, legal commentators were unanimous. Richards' testimony had been catastrophic to his defense, and the prosecution had built an essentially unassailable case. All that remained were closing arguments and the jury's verdict, which few believed would take long to reach. In the courthouse bathroom during a recess, Sloan stood at the sink, splashing cold water on his face. Chief Morrison entered and stood at the sink beside him. The two men had known each other for years, arguing opposite sides in many police misconduct cases. Tough case, Morrison said, not unkindly. They're not all winners, Sloan replied, reaching for a paper towel. But this one's different. I've defended a lot of officers who made mistakes under pressure. Richards isn't that. What he did to General Wilson wasn't a mistake. It was inevitable. Morrison nodded. That's what scares me. How many more like him are still wearing the badge? How did we let it get this far? Sloan had no answer as both men returned to a courtroom where justice seemed for once inescapable. After 12 days of testimony and evidence presentation, the trial of Officer Jackson Richards moved to closing arguments. The courtroom was filled to capacity, with overflow rooms set up to accommodate additional spectators and media. Outside, demonstrators from both sides maintained their vigils, though support for Richards had dwindled substantially as the evidence mounted. District Attorney Vanessa Jeffries approached the jury box for her closing statement. Her manner somber but confident, she systematically reviewed the evidence, the videos showing Richards' unwarranted aggression, the statistical proof of his biased policing history, the damning online posts revealing his racist beliefs, the testimony of fellow officers about his daily conduct, and finally, his own damaging admissions on the stand. Officer Richards didn't see General Marcus Wilson that day, Jeffries told the jury. He didn't see a distinguished military leader with 4 stars on his shoulders. He didn't see a man attending the funeral of a lifelong friend. He didn't even see a fellow citizen deserving of basic respect and dignity. Richards saw only the color of General Wilson's skin, and that alone made him reach for his weapon. Jeffries paused, allowing her words to settle over the courtroom. This case is about more than one incident on one day. It's about what happens when hatred and bias are allowed to hide behind a badge for 15 years. It's about the damage done to an entire community when those sworn to protect instead become threats to citizens based solely on race. The evidence has shown beyond any reasonable doubt that Richards acted not from proper procedure or legitimate security concerns, but from deep-seated racial animus that culminated in him pointing a loaded weapon at an unarmed, completely innocent man. Victor Sloan's closing argument attempted to refocus the jury on the concept of reasonable doubt and the pressures faced by police officers. He acknowledged Richards' regrettable statements, but argued they didn't prove his actions that day were motivated by racism rather than security protocols. The argument felt hollow after the mountain of evidence suggesting otherwise, and several jurors' expressions reflected skepticism. Officer Richards made a mistake in judgment, Sloan concluded, a serious mistake with serious consequences. But a mistake is not a crime when made in good faith during the performance of difficult duties. If there is reasonable doubt about his motivations that day, any doubt at all, your verdict must be not guilty. Judge Winters delivered careful instructions to the jury about the legal standards for each charge, explaining the concept of reasonable doubt and the specific elements required for conviction on the various counts. At 2:17 p.m., the jury retired to begin deliberations. Most legal analysts predicted a quick verdict, given the strength of the prosecution's case. Those predictions proved accurate. After just 4 hours and 23 minutes, remarkably brief for a case of this complexity, the jury signaled they had reached a verdict. As they filed back into the courtroom, their expressions were grave but resolved. The courtroom fell silent as the jury forewoman, a middle-aged black woman who worked as a hospital administrator, stood to deliver the verdict. On the count of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, we find the defendant, Jackson Richards, guilty. Richards showed no visible reaction as the forewoman continued through the list of charges. Official misconduct, guilty. Civil rights violations, guilty. And finally, the hate crime enhancement, guilty. The jury had reached unanimous decisions on all counts in less than 5 hours. Judge Winters scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later, remanding Richards to custody in the interim. As deputies led him from the courtroom, Richards finally showed emotion. Not remorse, but anger. His face flushed and jaw clenched as he glared at his former colleagues in the gallery. The sentencing hearing began with impact statements from those affected by Richards' actions. Elaine Taylor, widow of Sergeant James Taylor, spoke about how the incident had compounded her grief, turning what should have been a day of honoring her husband into a traumatic reminder of the racism he had faced throughout his life. James believed the world was getting better, she told the court. He believed his service helped move America closer to its ideals. Officer Richards didn't just disrupt my husband's funeral, he desecrated everything James lived for and believed in. Other funeral attendees described the fear and confusion caused by seeing a police officer draw a weapon during a solemn occasion. Several black residents of Oak Ridge Heights testified about their own experiences with Richards over the years, revealing a pattern of intimidation and disrespect that had gone unchallenged for too long. When General Wilson rose to deliver his statement, the courtroom fell completely silent. Unlike the others, he directed his words not primarily at Richards but at the justice system itself. "I stand before this court not seeking vengeance but accountability," Wilson began, his deep voice filling the room without need of the microphone. "What happened to me that day happens to black Americans without my rank or recognition every day across this country. Most don't have the benefit of multiple video recordings or national media attention. Most don't have the privilege of being believed without question." Wilson continued, "The verdict in this case is important, not for my sake, but for what it represents. Acknowledgement that wearing a badge does not place one above the law or give license to act on racial hatred. My hope is that this case leads not just to one man's punishment, but to genuine reform in how we select, train, and hold accountable those entrusted with protecting all citizens, regardless of color." Richards declined to make a statement on the advice of Sloan, who intended to appeal the verdict. Still, Judge Winters addressed him directly before pronouncing sentence. "Mr. Richards, this court has rarely seen such overwhelming evidence of both criminal conduct and the corrupt mindset behind it," she stated, her voice stern. "You betrayed your oath, your badge, and the citizens you swore to protect. Worst of all, you have damaged the vital trust between law enforcement and the community, a breach that will take years to heal." Judge Winters continued, "The position of police officer carries extraordinary powers, the authority to detain, to arrest, and in certain circumstances to use deadly force. With those powers comes equally extraordinary responsibility. When that power is abused based on racial hatred, the damage extends far beyond a single incident to undermine the very foundation of justice in our society." The courtroom remained utterly still as Judge Winters delivered her sentence. Life imprisonment for the aggravated assault with a deadly weapon with hate crime enhancement, with additional consecutive sentences for the other charges, effectively ensuring Richards would never be eligible for parole. The sentence, unprecedented in its severity for an officer who hadn't actually fired his weapon, sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community nationwide. Some police unions condemned it as excessive, while reform advocates pointed to the mountains of evidence showing that Richards' actions were the culmination of years of unchecked racial hatred while carrying a badge. As Richards was led away, His face ashen with the reality of spending the rest of his life in prison, the gallery erupted in mixed reactions. Some expressed vindication, others shock at the severity. General Wilson remained seated, his expression solemn but satisfied that accountability had been achieved. Outside the courthouse, crowds had gathered to hear the sentence. When it was announced, cheers erupted from those who had demanded justice, while a smaller group of Richard's supporters stood in stunned silence. Chief Morrison faced a forest of microphones to deliver a brief statement. Today's verdict and sentence send a clear message. A badge is not a shield against accountability, Morrison said firmly. The Oak Ridge Heights Police Department is committed to comprehensive reform to ensure nothing like this happens again. We have failed our community in the past by allowing officers like Richards to remain on duty despite warning signs. That failure ends today. As night fell, candlelight vigils formed in neighborhoods across Oak Ridge Heights. Not in protest, but in reconciliation, citizens and police officers standing side by side, acknowledging the pain of the past while committing to a more just future. The Richards case had forced a reckoning that many felt was long overdue. For General Wilson, the case would never be about his personal vindication, as he told a reporter who asked if he felt justice had been served. Justice isn't served in a single verdict or sentence. Justice is served when every citizen can trust that the law protects them equally, when every officer upholds their oath without prejudice, and when no one fears being targeted because of the color of their skin. We took a step toward that ideal today, but the journey continues. Richards was transferred to a maximum security state prison the following morning, beginning a sentence that would end only with his death, a fate he had never imagined when he approached General Wilson with his hand on his weapon, seeing only color instead of humanity. Ties can. The unprecedented sentence in the Richards case sent reverberations far beyond Oak Ridge Heights. Within 48 hours, the Department of Justice announced a pattern or practice investigation into the Oak Ridge Heights Police Department, dispatching a team of civil rights attorneys to examine whether Richards' actions reflected systemic problems rather than an isolated incident. Led by Deputy Assistant Attorney General Sophia Washington, the federal investigation obtained unprecedented access to department records, including personnel files, complaint histories, arrest statistics, and internal communications during the Wilkins administration. What they uncovered shocked even the most cynical observers. The level of institutionalized bias we've documented is staggering, Washington told reporters during a preliminary briefing. Under Chief Wilkins, there appears to have been an informal but understood system of targeted enforcement against black residents, particularly those moving into traditionally white neighborhoods. The investigation revealed that Richards was far from alone in his prejudiced policing. A special unit known unofficially as the Neighborhood Integrity Detail had focused excessive enforcement on black homeowners and renters in affluent areas, issuing dubious citations for minor code violations and conducting aggressive traffic enforcement near their homes. Email communications between Wilkins and certain officers, including Richards, contained thinly veiled racial coding, maintained community standards, address quality of life concerns, and ensure neighborhood character. All phrases the investigation determined were euphemisms for racial harassment intended to make black residents feel unwelcome. 4 officers identified as core members of this unofficial unit were immediately placed on administrative leave by Chief Morrison. Internal affairs investigations led by Captain Rodriguez found sufficient evidence of misconduct to terminate their employment within weeks of the Richards verdict. Former Chief Wilkins faced his own legal troubles when investigators discovered he had deliberately destroyed records of civilian complaints against officers he favored, including multiple complaints against Richards that had never appeared in his official file. The obstruction of justice charges carried potential prison time, forcing Wilkins to hire his own defense attorney as he found himself on the opposite side of a system he had once controlled. Mayor Amanda Calloway wasted no time leveraging the crisis for long overdue reforms. Working closely with Chief Morrison, she implemented a comprehensive transformation of the department. Today we announce the most significant police reforms in our city's history, Calloway declared at a town hall meeting attended by hundreds of residents. These changes aren't just about preventing another Richards incident. They're about creating the fair, transparent, and community-focused police department our citizens deserve. The reforms included mandatory body cameras with strict deactivation penalties, civilian oversight with real disciplinary authority, implicit bias training developed in partnership with civil rights organizations, and most significantly, a complete overhaul of hiring and promotion practices to prioritize community engagement skills and identify potential biases before officers receive their badges. To spearhead these changes, Chief Morrison made two key appointments. Officer Darnell Washington, Richard's former partner who had testified against him, was promoted to lead a new community relations division with authority to review patrol patterns and enforcement statistics for signs of biased policing. "I know firsthand how racism can infect policing from within," Washington told fellow officers during the announcement of his promotion. "My greatest regret is not speaking up sooner about what I witnessed. That silence ends today, not just for me, but for every officer in this department." Detective Sarah Chen, whose computer forensics work had uncovered Richard's online racism, was appointed to develop and lead bias recognition training. Her experience tracking extremist online communities gave her unique insight into how racist ideologies could be identified and addressed before they manifested in biased policing. "The internet has created new spaces where bias can be nurtured and reinforced," Chen explained during the first training session. "Understanding these digital ecosystems is crucial to identifying warning signs before they lead to Richards-type incidents." Not everyone embraced these changes. The police union, which had provided Richards legal defense, initially resisted what they characterized as politically motivated reforms that would hamper officers' ability to do their jobs effectively. Union President Michael Granville held press conferences criticizing the rush to judgment against the entire department based on one officer's actions. This resistance began to crumble, however, as more evidence emerged from the federal investigation, and younger officers increasingly distanced themselves from the union's position. A faction led by progressive officers formed a new association, called Guardians for All, committed to equality in policing and community partnership. Meanwhile, General Wilson channeled his unwanted celebrity into constructive action. Using his extensive military leadership experience and newfound platform, he established the Wilson Institute for Police Accountability, a non-profit organization dedicated to developing best practices for unbiased policing and providing implementation resources to departments nationwide. "We have an opportunity to transform crisis into progress," Wilson explained during the Institute's launch. "This isn't about vilifying police officers as a group. It's about creating systems where good officers can thrive while ensuring those who abuse their authority are held accountable." The Institute quickly gained national prominence, with Wilson testifying before congressional committees and consulting with police departments across the country interested in proactive reform. His military background gave him credibility with law enforcement, while his personal experience as a victim of racial profiling provided moral authority that transcended political divisions. In Oak Ridge Heights, the Taylor family established a scholarship in Sergeant James Taylor's name for minority students pursuing careers in public service, including law enforcement. The first year's fundraising goal was exceeded within weeks, with substantial donations coming from police officers themselves, a tangible sign of growing commitment to change. As reforms took root, statistical evidence began showing meaningful improvements. Racial disparities in traffic stops decreased by 62% in the first 6 months. Civilian complaints dropped by over 40%. Most tellingly, surveys showed Black residents reporting significantly higher trust in police, though the numbers indicated there was still considerable work to be done. 9 months after the verdict, Richards filed an appeal claiming the sentence was excessive and the hate crime enhancement unjustified. Legal experts gave the appeal little chance of success given the overwhelming evidence and Richards' own damaging testimony. The appeal seemed more an act of denial than a realistic legal strategy. More concerning to Chief Morrison were indications that Richards might have previously threatened other Black citizens with his weapon in incidents that went unreported or uninvestigated. Captain Rodriguez opened investigations into 3 specific allegations that emerged after Richards' conviction, potentially leading to further charges and justice for victims who had previously been afraid to come forward. 1 year after the incident at Sergeant Taylor's funeral, Chief Morrison stood before a joint session of Congress, invited to testify about the department's transformation. His testimony painted an unflinching picture of what had gone wrong and the difficult but necessary steps toward reform. The Richards case forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about our department and our profession, Morrison testified. We discovered that racism doesn't announce itself with hoods and burning crosses in modern policing. It hides in statistics, in discretionary decisions, in which complaints get investigated and which get buried. Addressing it requires continuous vigilance and systemic accountability, not just removing bad apples after they've caused harm. As Morrison spoke, cameras panned to General Wilson sitting in the gallery alongside Elaine Taylor and Officer Washington. Their presence embodied both the trauma that had necessitated change and the partnership now driving reform forward. Unlikely allies brought together by a tragic incident that could have been prevented through the very measures now being implemented. The Supreme Court was considering a case directly influenced by Richards' conviction, potentially establishing new standards for hate crime prosecutions involving police officers. Legal experts predicted a landmark ruling that would redefine accountability for biased policing nationwide, extending the ripple effects of that June day when an officer's deepest prejudices were finally exposed for all to see. 3 years had passed since Officer Jackson Richards pointed his weapon at General Marcus Wilson. In a maximum security prison cell measuring 8 by 10 feet, Richards had ample time to reflect on the moment that defined his life. Now, 51, with gray overtaking his once brown hair, he spent 23 hours daily in this confined space. A man who once patrolled freely now himself under constant surveillance. Richards had adjusted poorly to incarceration. His status as a former police officer made him a target among the general population, necessitating protective custody that further isolated him. During his rare interviews with prison psychologists, he maintained his actions had been justified and continued to express resentment toward the political correctness that had destroyed his career, rather than accepting responsibility for his own hatred. "I was just enforcing the law the way it should be enforced," he insisted during one session. "Everyone's so worried about feelings now that they've forgotten what keeps communities safe." The psychologist noted that even after 3 years, Richards showed minimal insight into his biases and zero remorse for the trauma caused to his victims. His appeals had been rejected at every level, with courts consistently upholding both the conviction and the sentence. Richards would spend the remainder of his life in prison. A fate he still couldn't fully comprehend had resulted from his own deeply ingrained racism. Outside those prison walls, Oak Ridge Heights had undergone a transformation that would have been unimaginable before the Richards case. The police department that had once harbored and protected racist officers had become a national model for reform, with departments across the country sending representatives to study their policies and practices. Chief Robert Morrison, now in his 5th year leading the department, had implemented changes that went far beyond superficial diversity training or public relations efforts. Every aspect of policing, from recruitment to patrol assignments to use of force policies, had been restructured with community input and transparent accountability measures. The Richards incident forced us to rebuild from the foundation, Morrison explained during an interview for a police leadership journal. We couldn't just add new policies on top of a broken culture. We had to examine every aspect of how we hire, train, promote, and hold officers accountable. The results spoke for themselves. Citizen complaints had decreased by 76%. Arrests showed no racial disparities when controlling for crime rates. Most significantly, surveys showed Black residents now reported similar levels of trust in police as their white neighbors, an achievement many had considered impossible just a few years earlier. Officer Darnell Washington, now Captain Washington, had transformed the Community Relations Division from a token office into a powerful oversight body with real authority. His initiatives included community review of patrol patterns, transparent investigation of all use of force incidents, and regular town halls where citizens could directly question department leadership about enforcement priorities. When I testified against Richards, many officers considered me a traitor to the badge, Washington reflected during a training session for new recruits. Today we understand that loyalty to the community and the Constitution trumps loyalty to individual officers who betray their oath. True loyalty means holding each other to the highest standard, not covering for misconduct. Detective Sarah Chen had been promoted to lead the department's newly established Professional Standards Bureau, where she continued developing cutting-edge methods to identify potential bias before it manifested in discriminatory policing. Her computer forensics background proved invaluable in monitoring online activity for signs of extremist affiliation during the hiring process. "We're not policing thought," Chen clarified when asked about privacy concerns. "But when someone seeking the power of a badge and gun actively participates in forums promoting racial hatred, that's relevant to their fitness for duty." The Richards case showed us the devastating consequences of ignoring these warning signs. Meanwhile, General Marcus Wilson had leveraged his Pentagon position to implement reforms in military-civilian law enforcement interactions nationwide. His promotion to a key advisory role had given him unprecedented influence in reshaping policies that affected both military personnel and civilian communities. "What happened to me was a symptom of a deeper problem," Wilson often stated in his presentations to police academies. "The solution isn't just punishing individual officers after incidents occur, but creating systems that prevent bias from influencing policing in the first place." Melissa Richards, now using her maiden name Collins, had divorced Richards within months of his conviction. She had rebuilt her life in another state, becoming an outspoken anti-racism advocate who shared her perspective on how seemingly normal people could harbor the kind of prejudices her ex-husband had concealed from her during their marriage. "I believed I knew the man I married," she explained during a TED Talk that garnered millions of views. "What I've learned is that racism doesn't always announce itself. It can hide behind a pleasant smile at dinner while festering in online forums and private thoughts until given the opportunity to express itself through power." One of the most significant developments in the years following Richards' conviction was the discovery of previous incidents where he had threatened black citizens with his weapon. 3 cases were reopened based on new evidence, leading to additional charges and civil settlements for victims who had previously been ignored or intimidated into silence. Danielle Foster, a black kindergarten teacher who Richards had held at gunpoint during a traffic stop 5 years before the Wilson incident, finally received both acknowledgement and compensation for her trauma. "I reported it at the time, but Chief Wilkins dismissed me as exaggerating," Foster recalled. "Watching the video of what happened to General Wilson was like reliving my own nightmare, except this time people believed it because they could see it." The Richards case had also reshaped legal standards through a landmark Supreme Court decision. In Wilson versus Oak Ridge Heights, the court established new criteria for applying hate crime enhancements to law enforcement misconduct, creating a clear, legal pathway for holding officers accountable when bias motivated their actions. The 7-2 decision referenced Richards' case extensively, with Justice Michaela Rodriguez writing in the majority opinion, "A badge cannot be both a symbol of justice and a shield against it." Perhaps the most meaningful legacy could be seen in the community that Richards had once patrolled with his personal mission of intimidation. Oak Ridge Heights had transformed from a community where racism often determined how justice was applied to one where genuine equity was not just a slogan, but an achievable goal. This transformation was symbolized by the James Taylor Community Center, built on land donated by General Wilson and named after the veteran whose funeral had been the setting for Richards' final act of discrimination. The center housed police community, partnership programs, youth mentoring services, and a civil rights museum chronicling both the Richards case and the reforms it had inspired. On the 3rd anniversary of Richards' sentencing, a dedication ceremony for a new wing of the center brought together figures from throughout the case: Chief Morrison, Captain Washington, Mayor Calloway, Elaine Taylor, and General Wilson. The wing would house expanded programs helping disadvantaged youth pursue careers in public service, including law enforcement. As Wilson cut the ribbon, surrounded by the diversity of a community that had faced its darkest truths and emerged stronger, he reflected on the journey from that June day when he'd found himself staring down the barrel of Richards' gun. 3 years ago, an officer saw the color of my skin as a threat, Wilson told the gathered crowd. Today, we stand in a place dedicated to seeing each other's full humanity. The path from that moment to this one wasn't easy. It required acknowledging painful truths, holding power accountable, and committing to genuine change beyond symbolic gestures. Wilson gestured to the young people in attendance, black, white, Hispanic, Asian, standing together as the center's first leadership cohort. This is what justice looks like. Not just punishment for wrongs, but creating the world we want our children to inherit. A world where no one fears those sworn to protect them, where accountability applies to everyone, and where the color of your skin doesn't determine whether you're seen as a general or a threat. As Wilson concluded his remarks, a class of new police recruits, diverse in every way and trained under the reformed standards, stood to applaud. Among them was Sergeant Taylor's nephew, inspired by both his uncle's service and the changes that had emerged from tragedy. The Richards case had begun with a moment of hatred, but had culminated in something like hope. Not the easy optimism that ignores problems, but the hard-earned progress that comes from confronting them directly. In police academies, law schools, and community organizations across the country, the case was studied not just for what went wrong, but for how addressing wrongs honestly could transform institutions and communities alike. The Richards case teaches us that racism doesn't always wear obvious labels. It often hides behind badges, uniforms, and positions of authority. When those with power act on prejudice, the damage extends beyond individual victims to undermine entire communities' trust in institutions meant to protect them. This story demonstrates that meaningful change requires more than removing bad apples. It demands examining the systems that allowed them to flourish undetected, the cultures that protected them from consequences, and the policies that enabled their biases to impact lives. The transformation of Oak Ridge Heights shows that accountability isn't the enemy of good policing, but its foundation. When officers know they'll be held responsible for biased actions, departments can begin rebuilding trust with communities they've marginalized. Perhaps most importantly, the case reveals that progress doesn't happen automatically. It requires brave individuals willing to speak uncomfortable truths, leaders with the courage to implement difficult changes, and communities determined to demand justice until systems truly serve everyone equally. The journey from Richards' Racist Act to institutional transformation reminds us that confronting America's racial inequities is painful but necessary work. Only by acknowledging our failures can we create the just society we claim to value. What experiences have you had with systemic racism in your community? Has something in this story resonated with your own observations about how prejudice operates within institutions? Comment below with your thoughts on how we can continue building more equitable systems that truly protect and serve everyone regardless of race. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories that expose injustice and celebrate those fighting for change. Share this video with someone who needs to understand how racism can hide in plain sight, because awareness is the first step toward transformation. Thank you for joining me for this important story. Remember, creating a more just world isn't just about condemning what's wrong, it's about actively building what's right. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and never stop working toward the world we all deserve.